The relentless sun beat down on the cracked earth of Burkina Faso as President Ibrahim Traoré stood at the bulletproof windows of his office, watching thousands of his people gather in the main square below. Their weathered hands clutched empty plastic containers, jerry cans, and metal buckets, symbols of a desperation that had grown more acute with each passing month of the third consecutive year without proper rainfall. "Water! Water! We want water!" The chant rose from the crowd like a prayer, echoing off the colonial-era buildings that still dominated the capital's skyline. Each voice carried the weight of a family struggling to survive, of children who had never known what it meant to turn a tap and see clean water flow. Traoré's weathered face remained impassive, but his dark eyes betrayed the turmoil within. At 52, he had led his country through coups, economic crises, and political upheaval, but nothing had prepared him for this, watching his people slowly die of thirst while the world's most basic resource became a weapon wielded by foreign powers. Defense Minister Colonel Amadou Urego entered the office with military precision, his boots clicking against the marble floor. A stack of folders under his arm contained reports that Traoré knew would only confirm what he could see with his own eyes. "Mr. President," Urego began, his voice heavy with the weight of bad news, "the situation deteriorates by the hour. 5 entire cities in the northern regions, Dori, Seba, Djibo, Gorom, and Tin Akof, have been completely abandoned. The populations are either flooding toward Ouagadougou or massing at the borders." Traoré turned from the window, his presidential sash catching the harsh light. "The Mali border situation?" "Closed tight, sir. President Guaita's government is dealing with their own internal struggles. The Niger River gives them some advantage, but they're not accepting refugees. Our people are trapped in camps along the border, makeshift settlements with no infrastructure, no sanitation." Urego paused, consulting his notes. "The mortality rates in these camps, especially among children and the elderly." "I don't need the statistics, Colonel," Traoré interrupted quietly. "I need solutions." Urego's expression darkened further. "There's more, sir. Aqua Global has implemented another price increase. Effective immediately, clean water is being sold at $3 per liter. More expensive than imported gasoline, and they're demanding payment only in euros or US dollars. The president's hands clenched into fists. Aqua Global, the French multinational corporation that had systematically bought up water rights across West Africa over the past decade. What had begun as infrastructure investment had become economic colonialism disguised as development aid. "They're not selling water, Colonel," Traoré said, his voice trembling with controlled fury. "They're selling our sovereignty, drop by drop. Every transaction makes us more dependent, more compliant. They want us on our knees." The office door burst open as Communications Minister Fatima Sawadogo rushed in, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled. Behind her followed Intelligence Chief Captain Issouf Sankara, his face grim. "Mr. President, we're under siege," Sawadogo announced breathlessly. CNN, BBC, France 24, Al Jazeera, every major international network is broadcasting live from the protests. The narrative is already set. Government failure, humanitarian catastrophe, calls for international intervention. Sankara stepped forward, producing a tablet. "The timing isn't coincidental, sir. Our monitoring stations intercepted coordinated communications between opposition groups and foreign contacts. Former Foreign Minister Rosmane Kabore held a press conference in Paris 3 hours ago." Traoré took the tablet, watching as his former ally, a man he had once trusted with the nation's diplomatic future, stood before a backdrop of French and European Union flags. Kabore's words were carefully chosen, calculated to appeal to international audiences. "The Traoré government has failed its people," Kabore declared in fluent French, his voice carrying the authority of his years in diplomatic service. "Burkina Faso needs immediate international assistance to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe. The international community must consider all options to restore responsible governance." The coded language was clear to anyone versed in diplomat speak. Kabore was calling for regime change. Traoré set down the tablet and moved to the large map of West Africa that dominated one wall of his office. The once blue rivers and lakes that had sustained his nation for generations were now marked in brown and red, indicators of drought, depletion, and desperation. "Look at this pattern," he said, tracing the borders with his finger. "First, Sudan, water infrastructure collapsed, government overthrown. Then Egypt, increasing dependence on international water loans. Libya, civil war erupted just as they were developing major aquifer projects. Now us." He turned to his advisors. "Look at this pattern. It's not coincidence, it's strategy. Control the water, control the continent." A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. His personal assistant, Marie Oedegro, appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Mr. President, Dr. Adama Zeta is here. He says it's urgent about the Blue Belt Project." The room fell silent. The Blue Belt Project was among Traoré's most closely guarded secrets, known only to a handful of trusted individuals. The fact that Dr. Zeta had come here, now, with protesters gathering outside and the government under international scrutiny, meant something significant had developed. "Send him in," Traoré commanded. Dr. Adama Zeta entered the office with the purposeful stride of a man bearing momentous news. At 34, he was young for such responsibility, but his credentials were impeccable. Geological engineering from the University of Ouagadougou, advanced studies in hydrogeology at Tsinghua University in Beijing, and 5 years working on China's ambitious south-to-north water transfer project. His weather-beaten face spoke of months spent in the Saharan wilderness, conducting surveys that most experts had dismissed as impossible. In his hands he carried a leather satchel that seemed to contain the weight of his nation's future. "Mr. President," Zeta began, his voice carrying barely suppressed excitement, "when I first presented the Blue Belt concept to you 2 years ago, you told me it sounded like science fiction. You may want to reconsider that assessment." He extracted a ruggedized tablet from his satchel and powered it on. The screen displayed a 3-dimensional geological model that seemed to peer through the Earth itself, revealing the hidden architecture of the Sahara Desert. "Gentlemen, what you're looking at is the result of 18 months of seismic surveys, satellite imagery analysis, and ground-penetrating radar studies conducted across northern Burkina Faso and the border regions." He manipulated the model with practiced ease, zooming in on a vast underground structure. "This is the Northwest Sahara Aquifer System, a massive underground water reservoir that extends beneath our territory." The room was absolutely silent as Zeta continued his presentation. The 3D model showed a vast underground lake, its boundaries crossing international borders like a hidden sea beneath the desert. The aquifer sits at an average depth of 400 meters below ground level. According to our most conservative geological estimates, it contains approximately 500 billion cubic meters of fresh water, dating back to the last ice age when the Sahara was green and fertile. Traoré leaned forward, studying the impossible numbers on the screen. "Dr. Zeta, Are you telling me that beneath our feet lies enough water to meet Burkina Faso's total water needs for the next century?" Zeta completed. "But, Mr. President, that's not the most remarkable part. The aquifer doesn't respect our modern political boundaries. It extends into Mali, Niger, Chad, and even touches Senegal. We're looking at enough water to transform the entire Sahel region." Defense Minister Urago spoke first. "The technical feasibility? Challenging but absolutely achievable," Zeta replied confidently. "The Chinese projects I worked on in the Gobi Desert faced similar geological conditions. The technology exists. Deep drilling equipment, high-capacity pumps, pipeline networks. What we need is political will and financial resources." Intelligence Chief Sankara raised a more ominous question. "Dr. Zeta, who else knows about these findings?" Zeta's expression grew serious. "The core survey team consists of 12 people, all Burkinabe nationals who have sworn confidentiality oaths. However, some of our equipment purchases and satellite imagery requests may have attracted foreign attention. The Chinese government is aware that I've returned to Burkina Faso, but they don't know the specifics of my work here." Traoré stood and began pacing, his mind racing through the implications of what Zeta had just revealed. "What would this project require?" Traoré asked. Zeta consulted his notes. Phase 1, exploratory drilling and initial infrastructure, approximately $2 billion. The complete project, including distribution networks to major population centers across multiple countries, would require between $5 and $6 billion. The astronomical figures hung in the air like a challenge to reality itself. That evening, deep beneath the presidential palace in a secure conference room that had been swept for electronic surveillance, President Traoré convened an emergency meeting of his innermost circle. The room's concrete walls, lined with signal-blocking material, created an environment where the most sensitive state secrets could be discussed without fear of foreign intelligence gathering. Present were Dr. Zeta, with his geological surveys and technical specifications, Intelligence Chief Sankara, with his foreign threat assessments, Defense Minister Urago, with military security reports, and Economy Minister Dr. Salif Diallo, whose expertise in international finance would be crucial for any major infrastructure project. The conference table was covered with maps, satellite images, geological cross-sections, and financial projections, the raw data of a dream that could transform a continent. "Let me present the complete picture," Dr. Zeta began, connecting his laptop to the room's secure display system. "The Northwest Sahara Aquifer System is a fossil water reserve, created during the Pleistocene epoch when North Africa had a radically different climate. Rivers flowed across what is now the Sahara, and these underground chambers were filled with fresh water." The screen showed geological timeline animations depicting the gradual desertification of North Africa and the sealing of the underground water reserves. "The water quality is exceptional, naturally filtered through sandstone and limestone for thousands of years. Our samples show mineral content that actually exceeds World Health Organization standards for drinking water. No treatment required." Economy Minister Diallo leaned forward, studying the financial projections. "Dr. Zeta, these cost estimates, how do they compare to our current water expenditure?" "That's the remarkable part, Minister. Our analysis shows that West African countries collectively spend approximately $10 billion annually importing water, purchasing water purification technology, and maintaining emergency water distribution systems. The Blue Belt project could pay for itself within 5 years, then provide virtually free water for generations." Intelligence Chief Sankara raised his hand. Before we get too optimistic, we need to discuss the geopolitical realities. Mr. President, the French intelligence services have been monitoring our activities more closely since the protests began. Any major infrastructure project involving water resources will be seen as a direct challenge to companies like Aqua Global. Defense Minister Urago nodded grimly. Our sources indicate that French military advisors in the region have been conducting readiness exercises with suspicious frequency. The patterns match preparation for rapid intervention scenarios. President Traoré studied the underground water map, his finger tracing the aquifer's boundaries. We cannot undertake this project alone, not financially and certainly not politically. The moment we begin serious drilling operations, we'll face immediate pressure from Western powers. What are you suggesting, Mr. President? Asked Dr. Diallo. Regional cooperation, Traoré replied. The aquifer extends across multiple borders. If we approach this as a collaborative project with neighboring countries, it becomes much more difficult for external powers to intervene. A Pan-African water independence initiative carries different political implications than a single-country infrastructure project. Dr. Zeta pulled up a regional map showing the aquifer's full extent. Mali, Niger, Chad, Senegal, they're all facing the same water crisis we are. Their governments are under similar pressure from their populations and from international water corporations. Sankara raised a pragmatic concern. Our relations with some of these countries are complicated. Mali's government is dealing with internal instability. Niger is caught between French and Chinese influence. Chad has its own political upheaval. Which makes this the perfect moment, Traoré countered. Crisis creates opportunity for cooperation. When people are thirsty, political differences become secondary. The meeting continued past midnight, with detailed planning for a multi-phase approach, initial secret negotiations with regional partners, technical cooperation agreements, coordinated geological surveys, and eventually a formal announcement of the Sahara Water Alliance. As the advisors prepared to leave, Dr. Zeta remained behind for a private conversation with the president. "Sir, I need to share something that wasn't appropriate for the larger group," Zeta said quietly. "During my time in China, I developed relationships with engineers and government officials who are now involved in the Belt and Road Initiative. If we proceed with Blue Belt, Chinese technical and financial support might be available, but it would come with its own geopolitical complications." Traoré nodded thoughtfully. The new great game in Africa, Western powers trying to maintain control, Chinese powers seeking to expand influence, and African nations caught in between. Perhaps it's time we started playing by our own rules. 3,000 miles away in Paris, the gleaming headquarters of the Directorate General for External Security hummed with activity despite the late hour. In a secure conference room on the 7th floor, Africa Desk Chief Philippe Dubois reviewed the latest intelligence reports from Burkina Faso with growing alarm. Dubois, a career intelligence officer with 20 years of experience in African affairs, understood the strategic implications of what his analysts were reporting. At 55, he had managed French interests through the Arab Spring, the Libyan intervention, and multiple coups across the Sahel. He knew that successful African independence movements posed existential threats to French economic influence on the continent. "Show me the satellite imagery again," he instructed his deputy, Captain Sylvie Moreau. The wall-mounted displays showed high-resolution photographs of northern Burkina Faso, taken over the past 6 months. Moreau used a laser pointer to highlight specific areas of interest. These are drilling equipment purchases, tracked through international shipping manifests. Seismic survey teams have been operating in these grid patterns. The geological equipment specifications suggest deep aquifer exploration. Dubois studied the images with the practiced eye of someone who understood that intelligence work often involved connecting seemingly unrelated dots. Personnel analysis? Moreau consulted her files. Dr. Adama Zeta is the key figure, hydrogeological engineer, educated at Tsinghua University in Beijing, spent 5 years working on Chinese water infrastructure projects in Xinjiang province, returned to Burkina Faso 18 months ago, and has been conducting surveys with a small team of local engineers. Chinese connection? Confirmed. Dr. Zeta maintains professional relations with senior engineers in China's Ministry of Water Resources. His former supervisor, Dr. Wang Lei, is now Deputy Director for International Cooperation for China's South-to-North Water Transfer Project. Dubois felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came with recognizing a strategic threat in its early stages. French interests in West Africa, uranium mines, gold extraction, agricultural exports, and water privatization generated billions of euros annually for French companies and maintained France's position as a global power despite its relatively small size. AquaGlobal's assessment, he asked. CEO Pierre Renaud is extremely concerned. They've invested over 3 billion euros in West African water infrastructure over the past decade. If countries in the region achieve water independence, AquaGlobal's entire business model collapses. The secure phone rang, and Dubois answered immediately. Foreign Minister, yes, sir, I have the full briefing prepared. Within an hour, a crisis meeting had been convened at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the Quai d'Orsay. Present were Foreign Minister Catherine Dubois, no relation to Philippe, DGSE Director General Marie-France Garnier, AquaGlobal CEO Pierre Renaud, and Presidential Advisor for African Affairs Jean-Claude Mitterrand. Philippe Dubois presented his analysis with the precision of a military briefing. The Traoré government is developing what they call the Blue Belt Project, a regional water independence initiative based on exploitation of the Northwest Sahara aquifer system. If successful, this project would eliminate French water corporations from the entire Sahel region and provide a model for resource independence that could spread across Africa. Foreign Minister Dubois, a pragmatic politician who understood that French prosperity depended on maintaining economic relationships established during the colonial period, grasped the implications immediately. Economic impact assessment, she asked. CEO Pierre Renaud responded with the urgency of a businessman watching his empire threatened. AquaGlobal's water sales in West Africa generate 1.2 billion euros annually. We employ 15,000 people directly and another 50,000 in supporting industries. But the strategic implications go beyond our company. If African countries achieve resource independence in water, they'll seek the same independence for oil, minerals, and agricultural products. DGSE Director General Garnier, a former military officer with extensive experience in African operations, presented the security perspective. Our monitoring stations indicate that Traoré is already reaching out to regional leaders. Mali, Niger, Chad, and Senegal are all potential partners. If this alliance forms and succeeds, French strategic influence across the Sahel will be fundamentally undermined. The room fell silent as the full scope of the challenge became clear. This wasn't just about water, it was about the entire post-colonial relationship between France and Africa. Presidential advisor Mitterrand spoke with the authority of someone who had shaped French-African policy for 2 decades. We have several options: diplomatic pressure through international organizations, economic sanctions, support for opposition groups, or, he paused meaningfully, more direct intervention. Foreign Minister Dubois was cautious about the final option. Direct intervention carries enormous risks in the current international environment. China and Russia are watching for any evidence of neo-colonial behavior. The African Union has become much more assertive. Even our European partners are questioning traditional approaches. Philippe Dubois presented an alternative strategy: Operation Water Coup, accelerated support for opposition groups, coordination with disaffected military officers, economic pressure through water supply restrictions, and a comprehensive media campaign highlighting government failures. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: create conditions that would force Traoré's removal through apparently internal processes, install a more compliant government, and quietly shelve the Blue Belt project. CEO Renault offered corporate support. Aqua Global can reduce water deliveries to Ouagadougou and other major cities, citing technical difficulties and equipment failures. This would increase public pressure on the government while providing cover for political intervention. DGSE Director General Garnier outlined intelligence operations. We have assets within the Burkinabe military and civil service. Former Defense Minister Colonel Mamadou Kabore has been in exile in Paris and maintains contacts with officers who could lead a transitional government. As the meeting concluded, Foreign Minister Dubois authorized the activation of Operation Water Coup, with a timeline for implementation within 60 days. But the French officials had underestimated both Traoré's determination and the regional support that the Blue Belt project would generate among populations desperate for water independence. 2 weeks later, at a remote military facility 300 kilometers northeast of Ouagadougou, President Traoré stood before an audience that represented the future of West African cooperation. The hastily arranged meeting had brought together water engineers, geologists, and government representatives from 5 countries, all united by a common crisis and a shared vision of regional independence. The facility, originally built during the Cold War as a communication station, had been chosen for its isolation and security. Solar panels and satellite dishes dotted the compound, while armed guards maintained discreet but visible security around the perimeter. Dr. Zeta had prepared a comprehensive presentation using the facility's upgraded conference room. Large screens displayed satellite imagery, geological cross-sections, and engineering schematics that illustrated the full scope of what they were attempting to achieve. "Ladies and gentlemen," President Traoré began, his voice carrying the gravitas of someone announcing a historic moment. "Today we gather not just as representatives of different nations, but as Africans determined to control our own destiny. The water crisis that affects all our countries is not a natural disaster, it's a manufactured crisis designed to maintain our dependence on foreign powers." The audience included Dr. Aminata Touré from Mali's Ministry of Water Resources, engineer Mamadou Issoufou from Niger's National Water Agency, Professor Sarah Ahmad from Chad's Institute of Technology, and Dr. Ousmane Fall from Senegal's National Water Company. Dr. Zeta presented the technical foundations of their proposal with the confidence of someone whose calculations had been verified multiple times by independent experts. "The Northwest Sahara aquifer system doesn't recognize our political borders," he explained, manipulating a 3-dimensional model that showed the underground water reserve extending across the region. "It's a shared resource that requires shared management, but more importantly, it represents shared opportunity for regional independence." Dr. Touré from Mali raised the first practical question. "The financial requirements are enormous. Our countries are already struggling with debt service to international lenders. How do we finance a multi-billion-dollar project?" President Traoré had anticipated this concern and had prepared a comprehensive response. "Traditional financing models have kept us dependent on Western institutions, the World Bank, IMF, European development banks. But the global financial landscape is changing. The BRICS New Development Bank, China's Belt and Road Initiative, the African Development Bank, and sovereign wealth funds from Gulf countries are all seeking infrastructure investment opportunities." Engineer Issoufou from Niger pointed to a more immediate concern. "The political risks are substantial. French companies control water distribution in much of our region. They will not surrender that control without resistance." "Which is exactly why we must act together," Traoré replied. Individual countries can be pressured, sanctioned, or destabilized, but a regional alliance pursuing water independence becomes a much more complex target for external intervention. The technical discussions continued through the afternoon, with detailed analysis of drilling locations, pipeline routes, pumping station designs, and distribution networks. Dr. Zeta and his counterparts from other countries compared geological surveys and agreed on coordinated exploration efforts. Professor Amat from Chad raised a strategic question that went to the heart of their endeavor. If we succeed with water independence, what prevents similar pressure when we address oil, minerals, or agricultural resources? President Traoré's response revealed the broader vision behind the Blue Belt Project. Success breeds success. If we prove that African countries can cooperate effectively on major infrastructure projects, if we demonstrate that we can manage complex technology and financing without external control, then we establish a model that can be applied to every aspect of resource independence. As the sun set over the Saharan horizon, the representatives from 5 countries signed a preliminary agreement establishing the Sahara Water Alliance. The document committed each country to coordinate geological surveys, share technical expertise, and work toward joint financing for what would become Africa's largest infrastructure project. But even as they celebrated this historic moment, intelligence reports were already reaching their respective capitals, warning of foreign interference operations designed to prevent the alliance from achieving its goals. Dr. Zeta approached President Traoré as the other delegates prepared to depart through secure routes that would avoid detection by foreign intelligence services. "Mr. President," Zeta said quietly, "the technical challenges of this project are manageable. The political challenges will be far more dangerous. Are we prepared for the level of resistance we're going to face?" Traoré gazed out at the endless expanse of the Sahara, beneath which lay the key to his continent's future. "Dr. Zeta, every independence movement in African history has faced similar resistance. The difference now is that we have knowledge, technology, and unity that previous generations lacked. We're not asking for permission to control our own resources. We're simply going to do it." 3 weeks after the formation of the Sahara Water Alliance, Operation Water Coup reached its implementation phase. The coordination between French intelligence services, disaffected military officers, and opposition political groups created a web of conspiracy that seemed certain to topple President Traoré's government. The morning began with what appeared to be spontaneous protests in Ouagadougou, but Intelligence Chief Sankara immediately recognized the sophisticated organization behind the demonstrations. Unlike previous protests driven by genuine desperation, these gatherings showed clear signs of external coordination: professionally printed banners, coordinated social media campaigns, and strategic positioning near government buildings. Captain Sankara burst into the Presidential Command Center, where President Traoré was reviewing the latest Blue Belt Project engineering reports with Dr. Zeta. "Mr. President, we have a developing crisis situation," Sankara announced, his usually calm demeanor cracking under the pressure of the unfolding events. "Large-scale protests have erupted across the capital. More concerning, our monitoring stations have intercepted communications between opposition groups and foreign contacts using encrypted channels that suggest coordinated timing." Defense Minister Urago entered the command center with an armful of urgent reports. "Sir, we have confirmed military defections. Colonel Mamadou Kabore, former defense minister, has been in contact with 2 brigade commanders from the northern garrison. They're moving approximately 800 troops toward the capital under the pretext of maintaining order." President Traoré set down the engineering reports and moved to the large tactical map that dominated one wall of the command center. Red pins marked protest locations, blue pins showed loyal military units, and yellow pins indicated units of uncertain loyalty. "Dr. Zeta," Traoré said calmly, "you need to leave the capital immediately. You're too valuable to risk in what's about to happen." As if summoned by his words, an aide rushed in with an expression of barely controlled panic. "Mr. President, there's been an attack on Dr. Zeta's residence. Armed men attempted to break in, but our security detail engaged them. The house has been set on fire." Dr. Zeta's face went pale as he absorbed the implications. His family, his research, his life's work all under direct attack because of his involvement in the Blue Belt project. "My family?" he asked desperately. "Safe," Sankara assured him. "Our protective detail evacuated them to a secure location as soon as the attack began. But the attackers were professional. This wasn't random violence." President Traoré made rapid decisions with the practiced efficiency of someone who had survived multiple coup attempts during his political career. "Dr. Zeta, you will be evacuated to the secure facility near the Mali border where we held our alliance meeting. Your family will join you there. Colonel Urago, status on loyal units. The Presidential Guard is 100% reliable. 500 elite soldiers with the best equipment. The capital garrison is split approximately 60-40 in our favor, but unit loyalty could shift depending on how events develop. The Air Force remains loyal, which gives us control of airspace." Intelligence Chief Sankara provided the broader picture. Foreign intelligence services have activated sleeper networks throughout the government. We're seeing coordinated resignations from key positions, financial system disruptions, and communication interference. The pattern matches textbook destabilization operations. Outside the palace, the sounds of civil unrest were growing louder, not just the chants of protesters, but the more ominous sounds of breaking glass, vehicle engines, and what might have been gunfire in the distance. President Traoré studied the tactical situation and made a decision that would either save his government or ensure its destruction. He would address the nation directly, revealing both the Blue Belt Project and the foreign conspiracy attempting to prevent African water independence. "Prepare for a live national broadcast," he commanded. "Full transparency. The people deserve to know why their government is under attack." "Sir," Captain Sankara warned, "a live broadcast reveals your exact location to hostile forces. It's extremely dangerous." "Everything we're doing is dangerous," Traoré replied. "But the people need to understand what's really at stake here. They need to know that this isn't just about political power, it's about the future of Africa." An hour later, President Traoré appeared on national television wearing his military uniform, a symbolic reminder of his role as commander-in-chief during a national crisis. Behind him, a large map of West Africa showed the extent of the underground water reserves that could transform the region. "My fellow citizens," he began, his voice carrying the weight of historic revelation. "Today, our nation faces a critical test. The protests you see in our streets are not spontaneous expressions of popular will. They are part of a coordinated foreign operation designed to prevent Burkina Faso from achieving water independence." As he spoke, social media platforms exploded with discussion of his revelations. The hashtag Blue Belt began trending not just in Burkina Faso, but across West Africa and beyond. "I want to reveal a truth that has been hidden from you. Underneath the Sahara Desert lies a massive water reserve, enough to supply clean drinking water to our entire region for generations. We have formed an alliance with neighboring countries to develop this resource and end our dependence on foreign water corporations. The camera zoomed in on the geological maps as Traoré explained the technical aspects of the Blue Belt Project, the regional cooperation agreement, and the potential for transforming West African development. "This is why we are under attack," he declared, his voice rising with passion. "Foreign powers and their corporate partners cannot accept African water independence because it threatens their entire system of economic control. They prefer to keep our people thirsty and dependent rather than allow us to develop our own resources." As the broadcast continued, its impact rippled across the capital and beyond. Military units that had been wavering in their loyalty began declaring support for the government. Citizens who had been confused by the day's events started to understand the larger context of what was happening. But the coup plotters were also watching, and they accelerated their timeline in response to Traoré's revelations. General Mamadou Bamara, commanding the rebellious northern garrison, ordered an immediate advance on the presidential palace. His forces, approximately 800 soldiers with armored vehicles and heavy weapons, began moving through the capital's northern suburbs with the intention of capturing or killing President Traoré before the Blue Belt Project could advance any further. However, Traoré's speech had an immediate and unexpected effect on both military units and civilian populations. As news of the underground water reserves spread through social media and word-of-mouth communications, the narrative of the day's events shifted dramatically. Soldiers who had been told they were responding to a government crisis began questioning their orders when they realized they might be helping foreign powers prevent African water independence. Civilians who had been focused on immediate survival began understanding that their long-term future was at stake. By midnight, General Bamara's advance had stalled as entire companies refused orders to move against the government. Colonel Kabore, the exiled former defense minister who was supposed to lead the transitional government, found himself commanding a rapidly shrinking force of supporters. Dawn broke over Ouagadougou to reveal that Operation Water Coup had failed, not due to superior military force, but because the Burkinabe people had chosen African independence over foreign dependency. 3 months after the failed coup attempt, a remarkable scene unfolded on the edge of the Sahara Desert in northern Burkina Faso. What had once been empty desert now bustled with activity as the first phase of the Blue Belt Project officially began. The ceremony site had been carefully chosen, an elevated plateau that provided commanding views of the endless Saharan landscape while offering symbolic significance as the place where Africa would begin reclaiming control of its most precious resource. A temporary platform had been constructed, decorated with the flags of all 5 Sahara Water Alliance nations: Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Chad, and Senegal, were represented not just by their national symbols, but by their presidents, technical teams, and thousands of citizens who had traveled to witness this historic moment. President Traoré stood at the podium, his eyes reflecting the determination that had carried him through the coup attempt and the months of intensive preparation that followed. Behind him, massive drilling equipment, some of the most advanced deep well technology available anywhere in the world, waited for the ceremonial command that would begin Africa's water revolution. "Today, we are not merely starting a construction project," Traoré declared, his voice carrying across the desert winds to the assembled crowd and the millions more watching via satellite television across Africa. Water is life, and today the control of our life returns to African hands. The presidents of the alliance countries spoke in turn, each emphasizing the historic significance of their cooperation and the message it sent to the world about Africa's capacity for technological achievement and regional unity. President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta of Mali addressed the broader implications. For centuries, our continent's resources have been extracted by foreign powers who told us we lacked the expertise to manage our own wealth. Today we prove that African engineers, African expertise, and African cooperation can accomplish what others claimed was impossible. Dr. Zeta, now serving as the Blue Belt Project's chief technical director, explained the engineering marvel they were about to witness. The drilling equipment behind him represented the culmination of 2 years of preparation, geological surveys that had precisely mapped the underground aquifer, engineering designs that had been tested and validated by independent experts, and international procurement that had acquired the best available technology from manufacturers in Germany, Japan, and China. This first drill will reach a depth of 412 meters, Dr. Zeta explained, his voice filled with the quiet confidence of someone whose calculations had been verified by multiple international experts. Based on our seismic surveys and test boreholes, we expect to reach the aquifer within 72 hours. The water we bring to the surface will have been underground for 10,000 years, naturally filtered and purified to standards that exceed World Health Organization requirements. The technical achievements represented by the Blue Belt Project were remarkable even by international standards. The drilling equipment could operate in extreme desert conditions. The pumping systems were designed for decades of reliable operation, and the pipeline network would eventually span thousands of kilometers across the Sahel region. But beyond the engineering accomplishments, the project represented something more profound, proof that African countries could cooperate on complex, long-term initiatives that required sustained political commitment, technical expertise, and financial coordination. President Traoré moved to the drilling platform, where a ceremonial control panel had been installed. Representatives from each alliance country joined him, their hands placed together on the activation switch. "For Africa," Traoré declared as they pressed the buttons simultaneously. The massive drilling rig roared to life with a sound that seemed to echo across the entire Sahara. The diamond-tipped drill bit began its journey through layers of sandstone and limestone that had remained undisturbed since the last ice age when North Africa was green and fertile. The crowd erupted in celebration, but for the technical teams monitoring the operation, this was just the beginning of a process that would require days of careful drilling, constant monitoring of geological conditions, and precise navigation to reach the target depth. Dr. Zeta stood with his international team of engineers, experts from China who had worked on similar projects in the Taklamakan Desert, German engineers specializing in deep well pumping systems, and African engineers who had trained at universities across the continent and were now applying their expertise to their homeland's development. "The drilling will continue 24 hours a day," Dr. Zeta explained to the media representatives covering the ceremony. "We have backup equipment, redundant power systems, and continuous geological monitoring to ensure we reach the aquifer safely and efficiently." As the ceremony concluded and dignitaries began departing for their respective capitals, President Traoré and Dr. Zeta remained at the drilling site, watching the steady progress of the operation that would either vindicate their vision or expose them to international ridicule. "What are you thinking, Dr. Zeta?" President Traoré asked, as the sun set over the Saharan horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "I'm thinking about my grandfather," Zeta replied quietly. "He used to tell me stories about the green Sahara, when rivers flowed and cities flourished where we now see only desert. He said the water was still there, waiting for us to be smart enough to find it." 3 days later, at exactly 4:17 a.m., The drill reached 412 meters and broke through into the ancient aquifer. The first gush of crystal-clear water that erupted from the borehole carried with it the hopes and dreams of an entire continent. The success of the first Blue Belt drilling operation sent shockwaves through international political and economic circles. Within 24 hours of water reaching the surface, the project had become global news, with implications that extended far beyond West Africa. In Washington, the State Department's Africa Bureau convened emergency meetings to assess the strategic implications of successful African resource independence. Deputy Secretary of State for African Affairs Janet Morrison presented analysis that framed the Blue Belt project as a potential catalyst for broader changes in U.S.-Africa relations. If this project succeeds as projected, Morrison told her staff, we're looking at a fundamental shift in African development paradigms. Countries that achieve resource independence become less susceptible to traditional diplomatic pressure and more likely to pursue independent foreign policies. The Chinese response was more nuanced. While officially celebrating African technological achievement, Chinese officials privately worried about the implications for their own Belt and Road Initiative investments in Africa. Dr. Wang Lei, Zeta's former supervisor, who now held a senior position in China's Ministry of Water Resources, found himself fielding calls from both African governments seeking technical assistance and Chinese officials concerned about geopolitical balance. The Blue Belt project represents exactly what the Belt and Road Initiative was designed to support: African countries using advanced technology to develop their own resources with international cooperation based on mutual benefit rather than dependency. But it was in European capitals that the Blue Belt success generated the most concern. The European Union's Africa Task Force, meeting in emergency session in Brussels, grappled with the implications of losing economic leverage over a continent that had been central to European prosperity for centuries. French President Emmanuel Macron personally called President Traoré to congratulate him on the project's technical success, while carefully probing for opportunities to maintain French involvement in the development process. President Traoré, Macron said during their video call, France has extensive experience in large-scale infrastructure projects. We would be delighted to contribute our expertise to ensure the Blue Belt project achieves its full potential. Traoré's response was diplomatically correct but strategically clear. Mr. President, we welcome cooperation with all nations on the basis of mutual respect and equal partnership. The era of dependent relationships is ending, but the era of cooperative relationships is just beginning. 6 months after the first successful drilling, the Blue Belt project had exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The initial pumping station was producing 2.5 million liters of clean water daily, supplied through a growing network of pipelines to communities that had been without reliable water access for years. Dr. Zeta stood in the project's main control center, a modern facility that had been constructed adjacent to the original drilling site, and now served as the nerve center for an operation that was expanding across multiple countries. Banks of computers monitored water flow rates, pipeline pressures, and pump performance across hundreds of kilometers of infrastructure. The water quality continues to exceed all expectations, Dr. Zeta reported to President Traoré during one of their regular video conferences. Natural mineral content is perfectly balanced for human consumption. Filtration requirements are minimal, and flow rates remain stable. But the technical success was only part of the story. The social and economic impact of reliable water access was transforming communities across the region. Villages that had been gradually abandoned due to water scarcity were seeing residents return. Schools that had been closed were reopening as families no longer needed to spend entire days searching for water. Small businesses, from food processing to textile production, were starting up in areas where water access made commercial activity viable for the first time in years. President Traoré visited one of these transformed communities, the village of Yako in northern Burkina Faso, where a Blue Belt distribution center had been constructed 3 months earlier. The contrast with his memories of previous visits was dramatic. Children playing in areas that had been dusty and barren, women tending gardens instead of walking kilometers to find water, men working on construction projects instead of migrating to cities in search of survival. Village Chief Mamadou Sawadago, a man in his 70s who had witnessed decades of gradual decline, spoke with tears in his eyes as he addressed the president. "You have given us back our lives. My grandchildren will grow up in a village with flowing water instead of fleeing to cities like refugees in their own country." The economic transformation was equally remarkable. Preliminary economic analysis showed that regions with Blue Belt water access were experiencing GDP growth rates of 15 to 20% annually, driven by agricultural expansion, small business development, and population stabilization. Dr. Aminata Touré, the Malian water engineer who had been skeptical during the initial alliance meetings, now served as deputy director of the Blue Belt project. Her assessment of the regional impact was unequivocal. "We're witnessing the fastest rural development in West African history. Water independence has catalyzed economic independence in ways we never anticipated." 2 years after the first drilling success, President Traoré stood before the United Nations General Assembly in New York City, addressing world leaders about the lessons learned from the Blue Belt project and their implications for global development. "Honorable delegates," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose vision had been validated by tangible results. "The Blue Belt project has proven that African countries can successfully cooperate on complex technological projects that benefit all our peoples. We have demonstrated that resource independence is not only possible, but essential for sustainable development." The statistics he presented were impressive. 15 million people across 5 countries now had reliable access to clean water. Agricultural production had increased by 40% in project areas, and the regional economy was growing at rates that exceeded most developed countries. But the most significant than the numbers was the precedent the project had established. Nigeria, Ghana, and Cameroon had announced their own regional water independence initiatives. The East African community was exploring similar aquifer development projects. South Africa was leading discussions about continental infrastructure cooperation. What began as a response to water crisis has become a model for African resource independence, Traoré told the UN Assembly. "We're proving that Africa's resources can be developed by Africans, for Africans, in partnership with the international community, but not under its control." The speech resonated far beyond the UN building. African universities were studying the Blue Belt project as a case study in successful South-South cooperation. International development organizations were revising their approaches to infrastructure financing in light of the project's success with alternative funding sources. 5 years after Dr. Zeta had first presented his impossible-sounding proposal in President Traoré's office, the Blue Belt project had evolved into something far beyond its original scope. What had begun as a desperate response to drought had become the foundation for a new model of African development. President Traoré, now serving his second term with overwhelming popular support, stood at the observation deck of the Blue Belt Central Command Center, a gleaming facility that coordinated water distribution across 5 countries and served as a symbol of African technological achievement. The view from the observation deck showed a landscape that would have been unimaginable 5 years ago. Where once there had been only desert, Small cities had emerged around pumping stations. Solar panel arrays stretched towards the horizon, providing renewable energy for the water extraction and distribution systems. Green agricultural zones dotted the landscape, where irrigation systems had made farming possible in areas that had been barren for generations. Dr. Zita, now in his 40th year and recognized internationally as one of the world's leading hydrogeologists, joined the president for their weekly review of project operations. The walls of the command center displayed real-time data from hundreds of monitoring stations across the Sahel: water flow rates, quality measurements, distribution statistics, and economic impact indicators. Current production is 50 million liters daily across all stations, Dr. Zita reported. We're operating at 85% of design capacity, with 99.7% system reliability. Water reaches 25 million people directly, with indirect benefits extending to an estimated 40 million people across the region. But the statistics, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. The Blue Belt Project had fundamentally altered the political and economic landscape of West Africa. The Sahara Water Alliance had evolved into a broader economic and political union, coordinating policies on trade, agriculture, education, and technology development. "What do you think your grandfather would say if he could see this?" President Traoré asked Dr. Zita, gesturing toward the thriving landscape below. Dr. Zita smiled, remembering the old man who had inspired his childhood fascination with water and geology. He would say, "We finally learned to listen to the desert. The water was always there, waiting for us to be wise enough to find it and brave enough to claim it." The Blue Belt Project had indeed proven that the water was there, not just physically beneath the Sahara, but metaphorically in the form of African capacity for technological achievement, regional cooperation, and resource independence. As they watched the sunset paint the Saharan sky in brilliant colors, pumps worked tirelessly below, bringing ancient water to the surface and carrying with it the foundation for a new chapter in African history. The Blue Belt had become more than an engineering project. It was a symbol of what was possible when African countries worked together with vision, determination, and the courage to challenge the assumptions that had limited their potential for generations. President Ibrahim Traoré had entered history not just as the leader who survived a coup attempt, but as the visionary who proved that Africa could control its own resources, develop its own technology, and chart its own course toward prosperity. And for him, this was just the beginning of a longer journey toward complete African independence, a journey on which the continent was no longer traveling alone. 10 years after the first Blue Belt drilling, Dr. Adama Zita stood before an audience of engineering students at the newly established Sahara Institute of Technology, built adjacent to the original Blue Belt drilling site. The institute had become one of Africa's premier centers for water engineering, renewable energy research, and sustainable development studies. "When we began this project," Dr. Zita told his students, "people said it was impossible. They said African countries couldn't cooperate on complex technical projects. They said we lacked the expertise to manage our own resources. They said we would always be dependent on foreign corporations and foreign aid." He gestured toward the windows of the lecture hall, which looked out over a landscape that had been utterly transformed by a decade of development. Modern cities with gleaming buildings and tree-lined streets, industrial parks producing everything from solar panels to water purification equipment, agricultural zones that fed not only the local population but exported food across Africa and beyond. Today, the Blue Belt Project provides water to 75 million people across 8 countries. The Sahara Water Alliance has become the West African Economic Union, coordinating development across multiple sectors. African universities are training the engineers, scientists, and technicians who are building the next generation of infrastructure projects. The students listening to his lecture represented the fulfillment of the Blue Belt Project's deepest purpose. They came from across Africa and beyond, young people who saw the continent not as a place to escape from, but as a place to build careers developing solutions to global challenges. But remember, Dr. Zita concluded, our success with water was just the beginning. Oil, minerals, agricultural resources, renewable energy. Africa has everything needed for prosperity. What we proved with the Blue Belt is that we have the most important resource of all, the knowledge, determination, and unity to control our own destiny. As his lecture ended and students filed out to attend classes on hydrogeology, renewable energy systems, and sustainable agriculture, Dr. Zita reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The young engineer who had once presented an impossible-sounding proposal to a desperate president had become the architect of a transformation that extended far beyond water access. The Blue Belt Project had indeed become what President Traoré had envisioned, not just a solution to water scarcity, but a model for African independence that was being replicated across the continent. And as Dr. Zita prepared for his next challenge, leading a continental initiative to develop Africa's renewable energy resources, he knew that the most important lesson of the Blue Belt was that Africa's greatest resource had always been its people. The water was there, beneath the Sahara, waiting to be discovered, but it took African vision, African engineering, and African unity to bring it to the surface and use it to transform a continent. The Blue Belt had proven that when Africans controlled their own resources, there was no limit to what they could achieve.